Hello, this research study examines students' perceptions of self-assessment in higher education. So just to give you some context in relation to this research study, my university developed a new learning, teaching and assessment strategy in 2015 and a key part of that strategy was student self-assessment, because we wanted to ensure that our students took more responsibility for their own learning, and we thought that self-assessment was a key way that we could get our students to take greater responsibility for their own learning. So I'm just showing you a quote by the Higher Education Academy in 2012, which emphasises really that assessment is one of the major challenges in UK higher education. We have an increasingly diverse student body, and we know that assessment and feedback is one of the areas of UK higher education that is often rated poorly in the National Student Survey. So there is a key challenge really for all higher education providers in the UK to improve their scores and to improve student satisfaction really in the area of assessment and feedback. Okay, so the Higher Education Academy focus really on, well, they've introduced a quote here that shows that summative assessment, i.e. the assessment that is often done at the end of a module, is often the dominant form of assessment in higher education. Now, we know from research that formative assessment, which is the more ongoing assessment, more frequent assessment, maybe assessment that takes place in sessions or between sessions, and assessment that students do themselves. So formative assessment includes self-assessment and peer assessment. We know that formative assessment has a much more powerful role in terms of student achievement than summative assessment. So it's really important that we focus on formative assessment and that we get formative assessment right, because it has real potential for improving student achievement. So we need to focus on areas such as self-assessment and peer assessment, and assessment within sessions and between sessions, to enable students to improve their achievements. So formative assessment refers specifically to assessment that is intended to generate feedback on performance and improve and accelerate learning. So it's assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. High stakes assessment, so this is assessment where marks or grades are given, tends to have a negative impact on student motivation, but often, unfortunately, the focus in terms of assessment is on summative assessment rather than formative assessment. So assessment where we're focusing on giving marks and grades, we know from research that students focus on the marks, they focus on the grades rather than focusing on feedback which will move their learning forward. So there's a real focus on high stakes assessment within UK higher education, and what we need to do is shift the focus so that we're focusing more on formative assessment, because formative assessment will accelerate learning and move learning forward in a way that summative assessment doesn't. So formative assessment is assessment that can be used to inform teaching, and we know from research that formative assessment has a powerful role in accelerating student achievement, and formative assessment can take many forms. It can be self-assessment, it could be peer assessment, it could be assessment within sessions or between sessions, but we know it has a really powerful role in improving learning, and often it's informal. It's not a formal type of assessment, whereas summative assessment tends to be more formal. So the whole rationale really behind us introducing more self-assessment and really having self-assessment as part of our learning, teaching and assessment strategy is that we wanted to as an institution, we wanted to engage students with the assessment criteria, because often we find that, you know, we set them an assignment, they have assessment criteria or marking criteria, and they don't refer to it. And it's the engagement with the assessment criteria that is going to help the students to move their work forward, to move it maybe from a 2-1 to a first, or a 2-2 to a 2-1. If they engage with the assessment criteria in a meaningful way, that is what will shift the standard and raise the standard of their work, to improve their work. Self-assessment gives students an opportunity to reflect on what they need to do further to improve their work. So if they self-assess their work as it's developing, as it's in process, then they can identify which elements of the assessment criteria they've evidenced really well, which aspects of the assessment criteria are evidenced strongly, but they can also identify which aspects of the assessment criteria need further development, and they can focus on those areas to actually improve the final product, and thus that helps to accelerate students' achievement. We also know that self-assessment, of course, is a critical skill in students' future employment. So once students enter employment, they need to be able to assess their own performance. They need to know what they're doing well. They need to know what their areas for development are. They're often not going to get feedback from other people, and they need to have that self-awareness of their own performance. So what better place to start the process of self-assessment than in higher education during their studies, to prepare students for what they're going to have to do later. One of the issues we find in higher education, and particularly within our institution, is that students very much see assessment as the tutor's job. It's something that we do as academics. We look at their work, we assess their work, we assign their work a mark, and we give them feedback, and they don't often see it as their job, and also when they've come through the schooling system, so they've gone through secondary education or further education, and it has been the tutor's job or the teacher's job to give the feedback and to make the assessments. So we found that what we needed to do was to front load self-assessment to the beginning of a degree programme, so that we bring it in right at the beginning of a degree programme, and we felt that if we did that and we brought it in right from the very start of a degree programme, they wouldn't actually see it as the tutor's job, and they would see it as something that actually they had a responsibility for as well as the tutor. So this research study focuses on student self-assessment in the first year of an undergraduate programme. So the focus of the research was to explore students' perceptions of self-assessment in higher education. Okay, so this is a larger scale study. So this study is going to eventually involve 3 focus groups of students from across the university. So in my university, we have 3 schools. So we have an Institute of Childhood and Education, a School of Arts and Communication, and a School of Social and Health Sciences. And the final study will involve a focus group of students within each school. So there will be 3 focus groups, 1 in each school, and there'll be approximately 6 students in each focus group. The focus groups will be mixed gender, okay, and eventually there will be a university-wide survey which examines students' perceptions of assessment and feedback, of which self-assessment will be an element of that. But this particular study that I'm reporting on now is just a pilot project using 1 focus group, so it is a small-scale study. But towards the end of this academic year, it will go on and become a much bigger study. Okay, so some of the emerging data that came out, the data was organised into key themes. So this was one of the themes. The students felt that the self-assessment process enabled them to become familiar with the assessment criteria. So they made comments such as, it helps me to understand the assessment criteria, it helps me to identify which aspects of the criteria need further work or further development. It enables me to understand what a good piece of work looks like, or what an excellent piece of work looks like, and that's through the process of engaging with the criteria. So they can look at the marking criteria, and they can see what they need to do to get a first, or a 2-1 or a 2-2. So it's really helping them to understand the standards or the expectations at different levels, and ultimately they said that it helps them to get a better grade. I think one of the most powerful aspects of this research really is that there was a shift in students' thinking, so they started to see that assessment was not just our job as tutors but also their job, and that they had a responsibility to take a greater responsibility for their own work. So we had comments such as, it enables me to take greater responsibility for my own work. I'm no longer dependent on the tutor to give me a mark, because I can assign a mark myself. And the students got very good actually at assigning their own marks, and there was often a very close fit between the student's mark and the tutor's mark. So they started to recognise that they were no longer dependent on the tutor to actually give them a mark, and they were able to make a reasonably accurate assessment of their own work. And therefore it enabled them to be more independent in their learning, and they weren't just kind of waiting for the tutor to give them that feedback, because they could make an assessment themselves. So that's really powerful. My mark is no surprise. So this is interesting. So what the students said to me in the focus group is that their mark was often very close to the tutor's mark. They're not waiting for the tutor to assign a mark, because I know how well I have done. I can make that assessment myself. And my tutor's feedback was the same as my own feedback. So the same areas of development were highlighted. So this is interesting that the students were very much engaging with this process, and it was empowering the students to take greater responsibility for their own learning. Some of the students started to recognise that they needed the skill, or they would need the skill of self-assessment within the world of work. So we had comments such as, I will need to assess my own performance in the world of work. I need to be able to know if my work is not good enough. Some of the students recognise, for example, that they wouldn't always get feedback on how well they were doing in the workplace, and that they needed to be able to assess themselves if they were doing a good enough job. So I need to be able to know if my work is good enough is very important, that they were beginning to recognise that they needed that self-awareness, and this process was helping them to develop that self-awareness. People don't always tell you how well you're doing. You need to be able to say yourself how well you're doing. So this is a really empowering result, really. It's showing that the students were very much empowered by this process, and it was enabling them to develop greater independence and take greater responsibility for their own learning. So in conclusion, from this very small scale one focus group study, the students valued the self-assessment process. They thought the process helped them to become familiar with the assessment criteria, and they were able to identify which aspects of the criteria their work was demonstrating really strongly, and which aspects of the criteria required further development within their work. It was making them more independent, and they saw the self-assessment process as a valuable life skill. So I think the findings of this small-scale study were very positive, and it will be interesting at the end of the year to do a university-wide study on self-assessment, and to carry out those focus groups in the different schools, and also to carry out the university-wide survey on assessments and feedback, and to see what the university-wide survey and the focus groups across the university are actually telling us. But certainly the results of this small-scale study were very positive. Students valued the self-assessment process. They felt it helped them to engage with the marking criteria, and they felt it was enabling them to be more independent and to take greater responsibility for their own learning. Thank you.